And I want to talk about, I want to hear you talk about, your relationships with children, with young people, and the way that relationships between adults and children are mandated in certain ways to take certain forms in our culture, so that, often we're only sort of allowed to have relationships with adults in institutionalized settings like the classroom or on the sports field. But, God forbid you befriend an adult, and that person has meaning in your life. And I think some people certainly are better at this than others. And I wonder what your thoughts are on
Yeah. And that's become even touchier as the years go by.
It does seem to be the case, doesn't it?
Yeah, to the point where you have to be so careful. You don't want to lay a finger on a kid for fear of getting charged with something. Maybe it was because I just had one brother, spent a lot of time roaming around the west end of Norristown by myself, not having gotten married till late.
Late? How old were you?
Mid-30s.
Okay.
Before then, having very little to do with little kids, uncomfortable with babies and inexperienced with little kids. So maybe for those reasons, I never did much practice on relating to kids, to little kids. And so I kept my own way of expressing myself, and when it came time to start writing about kids, because I felt like writing about this kid in junior high school, I guess my inclination was to simply just keep on talking and behaving and presenting myself the way I normally did to the world, rather than editing myself for little kids or something like that. I remember when I wrote my first published book, Space Station 7th Grade, I didn't write it for kids. I just wrote it because it interested me, and to the extent that I was audacious enough to imagine an audience, I imagined it as an audience of people like you and I looking back on those days, and I thought it was kind of interesting remembering those junior high school days, and I figured, well, maybe other people would find that interesting too. And so I just went ahead and wrote it, imagining that there would be an audience, if it ever got published, of so-called grown-ups. And as it turned out, my agent sending it around to publishers was being told everywhere it landed, well, this is a book about a kid, this belongs in the juvenile department.
Fascinating.
And so she told me this after a year of trying that, and she said, so what do you think about my showing it to the juvenile departments? I wasn't crazy about that idea, but I said, yeah, go ahead. And that's where it landed. And that's how I accidentally became this thing known as a children's writer. I don't consider myself a children's writer. I don't write for kids. I write about kids. And
Henry James writes about kids, and who isn't categorized as, I'm thinking of The Turn of the Screw.
Sure, yeah, sure, yeah.
And of course, Mark Twain.
Yeah. Well, publishing industry is much more categorized these days and specialized and cubbyhole.
It's partly about the creation of a readership too, certain consumer groups,
I guess so.
right, who need to be identified for the book.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's also a symptom of what we're talking about, which is a kind of gaffer gulf that gets invented that must always be in place, it seems, between the adult and the child. Conceive of your novels as for a young adult audience, and that they would market it that way. And that seems related to the question that I started with, which has to do with these divisions that were drawn culturally between adults and children. Clearly, I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't a distinction, but that there are ways in which we created pretty firm boundaries between the spheres that children and adults operate in. And I think to both of our, just does a service to both adults and children.
I think so, yeah. I've, ever since that first book, I have lobbied, encouraged publishers to at least investigate the possibility of crossing over with some of my books. Because there are books of mine that if I were asked to prepare an adult version, I wouldn't do a thing. I wouldn't change a thing. I remember once I was described in a newspaper as a purveyor of kitty lid. And I wrote the writer a nasty letter, and it's the kind of thing that makes me bristle. But you know, that's what all too many folks out on the street think. That's how they think of so-called children's writers. So this is the sort of thing that we're contending with. They think that oh, you're a children's writer, isn't that cute? And when children's writing comes to mind, what they think of is see Dick throw the ball, see Jane run. It's the old Dick and Jane
Well,
stuff.
it seems to me that one of the worst implications of this is that it seems to denigrate children in the process.
Oh, yeah.
And child
Oh, yeah.
consciousness,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I mean, I often find that in social situations, that the children are the people I most want to talk with, the people I have more interesting conversations with. I've been in many social situations in which I've preferred having conversations with the children than with the adults in the room. You know, they're doing the more interesting thinking.
Yeah.
They have the more interesting things to say.
Yeah.
These sorts of things should be obvious, and if they're not, you know, so
Yeah.
this assumption that if you're writing for children, for example, then somehow it must be simple,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, exactly.
I kind of one of the things I work with in my book actually is the matter of precociousness in children, what children are allowed to know, and the assumption that a child who knows too much or knows beyond her years